Bytes and Banter number 30. And today I'm joined by Marie McGinley from Eversheds. Hello, Marie.
Hi, Gary. How are you?
I hope I've got the name right. Have I? Please tell me.
You have. You have.
Wow. After 3 years of trying, I've finally succeeded where I thought I'd fail. And we're here to talk about GDPR is 5 years old. My goodness.
Hard to believe.
It's hard to believe, but it seems like the build-up was about 20 years old, and then it was announced, and for most of us, it just came and went. But for somebody like you who was a data protection practitioner well before GDPR, what has it meant before and after? And can you tell us a bit about sort of GDPR being 5 and what we should or should not be aware of?
Of course, yeah. So maybe just to take a step back, I started advising on data protection back in 2007. So quite a while before the GDPR came into play. And I suppose if we look at kind of the pre-GDPR legislation, particularly the legislation we had in Ireland, we had data protection legislation in place in Ireland in 1988. So
Wow.
Ireland was fairly ahead of the curve when it came to data protection.
Hmm.
Now, it was a very different beast in terms of the obligations were not as robust when it came to enforcement. Obviously, we didn't have the same offences, fines, administrative fines that you now have in the GDPR. But there were
Okay.
certain industries where confidentiality, and I think that's really what we got to know, confidentiality was the kind of pre-data protection term, if that makes sense. When it
Yes.
came to confidentiality, people were always very sensitive about their information, what was done with their information, who had it, and who knew what about them. So I think kind of if you look at it like that, that was always a key priority. But there were certain industries, and if we look at some of the regulated industries, for example, where data protection was always a key focus, and we would have seen that in advising clients. And the data protection commissioner would have, let's say, taken sectors and undertaken sweeps with regards to those particular sectors. And in effect, sought to enforce data protection in a way that was collaborative in advance of the GDPR. Then fast forward. Oh, no, carry on, Gary.
So it really was. So 5 years ago, that's 2018. It was a culmination of bringing together of what best practices, learnings, anticipated what we need to be mindful of. But to your exact point, data privacy, data protection, sovereignty, it probably was there since we started sending pigeons to each other. Any form of data needs to be protected.
Yeah.
So what did it mean then? Either good or not so good for someone like yourself, who was a practitioner for nearly 12 years beforehand. Did it put straitjacket on you? Did it help you? What did it exactly do for the practitioners?
So, from a practitioner perspective, and maybe if we take a step back and if we were acting for clients that had operations in various jurisdictions, the best way we could describe pre-GDPR data protection legislation is a patchwork quilt. We had the EU directive, and every country had the ability to introduce their own data protection legislation that was based on the EU directive. So yes, they all had the same base in terms of what we call the data protection principles, which remain within the GDPR. But in effect, every country had their own way of introducing it and their own legislation, and then they had their own regulator who had their own views in how that was enforced. So you had certain regulators who didn't enforce by way of offences, you had others that did. So that was the pre-GDPR landscape, and I suppose what that did was, it, from an advisory perspective, you had to, obviously, we advise on Irish law here in the Dublin office. So we obviously had to be very aware of what the position was in Ireland. But where we had global clients or multinational clients with operations in various jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, you had to understand what the nuances were in other jurisdictions so as to ensure that you could advise your client, look, you better get advice in Germany, you better get advice in France and Spain. So the purpose ultimately of the GDPR was to overhaul data protection and to, in effect, try and create a level playing field. Now, there are various views as to whether that has been achieved or not, but that was the purpose of introducing a regulation. So it would be directly effective on every country. And obviously then, if there were certain local derogations in each jurisdiction that needed to be introduced to give effect to that regulation, it could be done. So I suppose the purpose of the GDPR was to create a level playing field.
Yeah.
But I think what's important is, if we look at the base of GDPR, it's in effect the data protection principles. So the obligations stem from the data protection principles. So they're your lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation. So these are principles that in reality have not changed. They are based on OECD principles. And what the GDPR has done is created a piece of legislation, as I said, that's directly effective, that sets out prescriptive obligations in relation to compliance with data protection and how you collect personal information, personal data, what you do with it, and what you tell people. So it's, I tend to refer to it as the who, why, when, where, how to of personal data. That is effectively what it is. You need to know who has your data. You need to know what they're doing with your information, why they have it, how long they're going to hold, effectively what steps they've taken and put in place to actually address and comply with those obligations. So from that perspective, it's about effectively trying to align the principles with prescriptive obligations.
And do you find that that's part of our challenge? The way you've just described it there, the who, what, why, and for how long, is the most simplified. I'd love, in my mind, I think in pictures, I see that as an infographic, a simple bullet point infographic with lovely. I think part of the challenge is that there's a lot of legalese speak, there's a lot of like every industry, a lot of jargon and a lot of technical stuff. But you're dealing with people who are retail owners or small hotel owners, and sometimes that scares the living bejapers out of them. Is that part of the biggest challenge? Is that, no disrespect, but a lot of people, when we think of legal and lawyers and people like that, we go, ooh, that's going to cost me a lot of money, or it's going to be painful. Part of where we're at is just to make it more people, society friendly, or am I too simplifying it?
Oh, no, absolutely, Gary. And I think that's really important, because with any piece of legislation, irrespective of whether it's the GDPR or not, when it comes to implementation, it has to, let's say, be created in a manner that works for the people that need to comply with it, number one, but those that benefit from it, number two. And that is critical. At the end of the day, the GDPR and the obligations around data protection, privacy, and confidentiality have been introduced to help people. That's effectively what it is. And Obviously, there's a lot of commentary in terms of how it hinders and creates costs. I get that. But
Mm,
I think one of the fundamental kind of objectives that need to be achieved, and I do think a significant amount of work has been done to achieve this, is to actually create, as you say, a process and a principle based piece of legislation that is understandable for organization, because not everyone has legal teams, internal compliance teams, and the likes. There are small organizations, but there are not even organizations, Gary. There are sole traders out there that are subject to this piece of legislation. If
agreed.
you're collecting names, addresses, email addresses, dates of birth, so on, and using it for anything, you are required to comply with data protection. And
Yeah.
maybe just to touch on one of the points that the GDPR introduced that was somewhat different to the older legislative regime, and that is it set out your compliance obligations, where the GDPR introduced a new concept that has actually been mirrored now by various other um, pieces of legislation, European
Mm,
legislation, and
mm,
that is the accountability principle. So that is demonstrating compliance. And that's really where, in my mind, and in reality, there is a practical burden on organizations, because not only do you need to show you're compliant, you need to demonstrate that compliance by having in place your privacy notice, which, back to the point, that's your who, why, when, where, how to document that you give to individuals that tells them exactly what they need to know in relation to the data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and what you're going to do with it.
I
And
guess
then, oh yeah,
time helps, doesn't it? Time helps a great deal because
yeah,
change, like everything in our society, change is always resisted, embraced, or run away from, or somewhere in between. So I guess the more and more people get comfortable that, to your point earlier, this isn't an overhead set upon organizations and individuals and so forth for the sake of putting them in a straitjacket. It's actually to protect them and the people, their clients. That's the key objective of this, is to protect ultimately the citizens, and then also the companies, to give them some sort of a roadmap or a set of principles by which, if they're seen, is that fair to say, if you're seen to be doing everything you can, then that's probably as good as you can do. It's like the kids that they're leaving cert at the moment. If you study hard and you do your best, whatever the results are, the results.
mhm.
It's the people that sort of avoid it. Would that be fair to say? How now that we're 5 years in, when you look at data protection from a data protection commissioner's perspective, of course, how do they view people at the moment in terms of best efforts,
Mhm.
do your best? Well, how is it viewed from companies
Yeah,
and
one thing I would say, and we see this firsthand, it, I caught the first
think
part
we've
of
lost?
your question, Gary. I didn't catch the end, so I might just, can you hear me?
Yeah. No, yeah, no, absolutely. So 5 years in, obviously, data protection commissioners now have had 5 years to look at companies in compliance or non-compliance and stuff. How are they viewing when they go in to companies? Is best practice doing your best with tweaks, or are they very heavy-handed, or what's that landscape like?
Yeah, so from a practical perspective, and what we are seeing on the ground is that the Data Protection Commissioner understands that no organization is infallible when it comes to kind of breaches or incidents and the likes. And when it comes to compliance, I'll be honest, I would struggle to find any organization that is 100% compliant. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yes.
In saying that, what I have seen in the last 5 years has been transformative. So, as I mentioned, kind of pre GDPR, a lot of regulated entities would have taken data protection seriously.
Mm,
Some organizations, it just was not on their radar.
mm,
And I think that was the biggest kind of transformation for with the introduction of the GDPR. It introduced fines, it introduced liability, it introduced a new concept of responsibility that changed the mindsets of organizations when it came to compliance. And that, in reality, was the purpose of GDPR. It was to bring it into focus and to ensure that organizations didn't shy away from their responsibilities and didn't use data in a way that was unethical and was not as envisaged by data protection legislation. So,
yeah.
from that perspective, organizations and the regulator in reality will work together, and we see collaboration a lot between organizations and the regulator.
Mm,
It's a case of putting your best foot forward, work understanding what you have and what you're doing with it, and being sensible with the information. That is not to say if you have an organization that are creating, let's say, client lists and selling them right, left, and center, they will not receive the same, let's say, patience as others.
yeah.
It's about being sensible.
Okay, and obviously, as you say, and I certainly know from my own world, the explosion of data and digitalization, and if we thought it was going fast pre the pandemic, post the pandemic, it's even on more heavy steroids. And then, of course, we now have, not that it wasn't there before, but let's say it's in accessible to all sides of organizations. We've got generative AI. My goodness, that must
Mhm.
once again put another load of fuel on the fire that was already burning pretty strong. Have you any comments or observations about what that's done to your landscape?
Yeah, I suppose, well, generative AI is very much in focus at the moment, and it
Yeah.
is in focus. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the challenges faced by organizations when it comes to data protection arises with all new emerging technology, particularly where that emerging technology in any way uses personal data. And
Mm,
I think generative AI is a very good example here.
mm.
And I know when we talk about generative AI or AI in itself, and it is not a new concept. Machine learning has always been there, but
Yeah.
one of the things I think now that has really come into focus is the extent of the use and how popular it has become, and it will continue to become in the coming months. I can't see that waning. But if we take a step back and just look at basics,
Mm.
if there is data going in and if data is being used and if data is being kind of part of the output, this doesn't change the requirements from a data protection law perspective. The
Oh,
challenges it creates is, how did the data get in there?
yeah.
What is being used? Where's the data being collected? And this is where I think that this challenges will be created here and are being created, because in effect, when it comes to any form of generative AI, and you look at kind of what effectively, back to what the OECD had created in terms of data protection principles, they've created what you term the responsible AI principles as well. That when you look at these principles, they're very aligned. It's about ensuring that the system is safe and effective, that the
Yeah.
system is fair and non-discriminatory. You see the same information coming back, the same base principles. So
Yeah.
essentially the system needs to protect the privacy and confidential information that is contained within it. So like if you look at it from a personal data perspective, what personal data is being used and who controls it, who's entering it, and what's happening to it. And it's back to the who, why, when, where, how to. And if we use that as our base, that will apply regardless of the new emerging technology. So when it comes to generative AI, these principles will remain. And I know obviously we've got the EU AI Act, and we will have, let's say, different pieces of legislation that will govern all these various forms of technology. And this is one challenge, I think, for the technology industry as a whole at the moment. You've got data protection in one vein. You've got legislation that governs new technology. You've got then your security requirements under NIS2 directive and so on. These are all separate pieces of legislation, but the basis for each of them are all the same. And you will see realms of data protection flowing through the various, let's say, the Digital Services Act and the NIS2 in terms of the security requirements. It is touching everything. So
And
it's important to,
that's
yeah,
exactly your point earlier. It's a bit like there's a blueprint there, probably my
yeah.
incorrect words on my part, but there's something, a term of reference there to be tapped into. And it's interesting. I have two further questions for you. And one of them is, when I listened to people early on, it was always about, well, if you're starting as a company, you can do what's called security by design and privacy by design. But if you're looking after legacy stuff that you've gathered over the last 40 years of COBOL and mainframes and stuff, how has all that worked itself out? Legacy data and getting consent and, all that type of good stuff that was presented as a real challenge, as I say. Going forward, new stuff, no problem. We can have a tick box. Legacy stuff, was that as big a challenge as people were making out?
Um, my answer is going to be yes or no, and it could be challenged that this is a typical lawyer answer, but I do think it really depended on the client and the
Oh,
amount of work that was undertaken. So there was, let's say, for some organizations, the the legacy work was a nightmare. There's no way of me sugarcoating it. It
yeah.
was a nightmare. We are 5 years on and we've worked with many clients, and I have to commend them. They have done absolutely phenomenal work in this space,
Mm.
and they continue to do so. And then there were those who, to be fair to them, took data protection seriously long before GDPR.
Yeah.
So when it came to the legacy issues were not as bad for those organizations. I think yes, there are many organizations and individuals that have been completely scarred by the process, but I think the benefits very much outweigh the negatives when it comes to what was required. I think we are now in a society where we can be confident that our data and you and I's data, so any information relating to a living individual, is protected in a manner that it should be. And where it's not, we have rights as
Yeah.
individuals. And I think even in terms of the knowledge generation for individuals to understand their rights has been phenomenal, and it's been brilliant because
Yeah.
we as a society, particularly in Ireland, took confidentiality very seriously.
Mhm.
And I think kind of that now has just kind of moved its way over to the data protection framework as such.
So we started on the show this week is called GDPR's 5. I guess the fact that it's been adopted, or forms of it are being adopted globally. I hear APAC and
Mhm.
California and all this. I guess that's testimony to your point that it is more of it is working than isn't working, as other places are using it as their template. Is that reasonable, or are they just being lazy in the other places? Or is it, what's your view, that is there a possibility as we continue globalization and as globalization becomes digital at first, that we could in a certain period of time have a global data protection framework?
So maybe just to touch on your first point, I would fully agree. I think when it comes to data protection and GDPR, it is very much classed as the blueprint, and a lot of other jurisdictions are very much following that blueprint.
Okay.
And I think, as you say, they've seen the benefit. Yes, there's a burden from a compliance perspective, but I think the benefits in those instances outweigh the burdens. And also, I think those jurisdictions, and look, let's look at it from a commercial perspective. They can actually see how, for individuals, customers, and organizations, the benefit that and the attraction to Europe because of this framework. So
Oh,
I think that is very much part of it as well. And it's important to, I think, acknowledge that piece. And I
yeah.
think, kind of, from organizations then that are compliant, in reality, it does give them a competitive advantage, because you can give your customer that assurance that
Yeah.
you protect the information. It is located in a jurisdiction that has rules that protects personal data. So that's that piece. And then in terms of the globalization piece, well, I think that would be a welcome addition. In reality, I think each jurisdiction will maintain their own legislation. But I think if we see an element of harmonization, it will make it probably not easier for compliance from a multinational perspective, or organizations that have offerings in various jurisdictions. What it'll do is it'll create consistency, and I think that consistency is very welcome, because when you have consistency, you're then into a realm where it becomes the norm. So compliance will become the norm, protection of personal data will become the norm, and people's rights will become the norm. So I think that's really what we should aim towards, because I would love to see globalization, but in reality, I don't think it will ever happen.
Well, that's as good a place to stop as any. We could talk about it for way longer than the 20 odd minutes. And I thank you so much for simplifying with simple words and with a 95% reduction of jargon that I normally hear on this subject. Thank you so much. And I also would like to take an opportunity to congratulate you, of course, on you're not just a speaker of common sense, but you obviously know what you're talking about. You won a international award for legal person of the year recently, I believe.
Thanks a million. Yeah, thank you.
That's wonderful. And from your own perspective, and looking at the industry, and this will be the last question, do you find that the type and ilk of person being attracted to your industry and practitioners is changed over the years? Are there more young people really leaning into this area, and knowing what they're getting into, as distinct to, I guess, a lot of practitioners were lawyers who then subsequently took on a certain skill or interest? Are people actually now getting on board? This is what they want to be from the start, or am I simplifying it?
No, absolutely, Gary, and I think it's something that I like from my own perspective, and seeing kind of people on my own team, and
Yeah.
also, let's say, mentoring under other individuals who are starting off their legal journey by doing a law degree, and kind of trying to identify what areas of law they want to specialize in. We are
Hmm.
seeing so many people looking to these areas of law, be it technology or data protection,
Wonderful.
because I think consistently evolving. So it's not like we have a piece of legislation that is completely static. I can say from my own perspective, when it comes to my day job, I may have a to-do list this morning that could be thrown out the window by the afternoon. And when it comes to, let's say, and you mentioned generative AI, let's say, when we're helping clients develop exciting new technologies, we are constantly looking at them from all different angles. So you never stand still. It's constantly moving. We need to educate ourselves consistently. So it is an exciting area to be in.
Fantastic. And that's wonderful. And I think we'll close the episode with that. Marie McGinley, thank you so much for your time. We had a bit of a glitchy start, but I think we made up for it with your wonderful content. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And with that, have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.